Hello, I'm Sophie. This is a series of presentations about the Taubman-Golandsky approach to strings. The presentations form a comprehensive series, but have also been designed to work alone, so they can be used in various ways. They address some of the fundamental principles of the approach and show how these principles can provide answers to some of the most commonly asked questions by players of all levels, from professionals to students. The information presented makes most sense when we feel it ourselves, combining knowledge and sensation. There is an immediately recognizable, clear physical logic to it. While these presentations are not a substitute for hands-on work, they can offer an entry point to this wonderful information. Off the string in detail. So this question comes up so frequently that it really needs visiting as its own topic. It's always helpful to find a simple analogy. So if we look at how we bounce a ball and steer it in different directions as we walk around, we have the same ingredients at work that we need for off the string playing. The first important thing to notice is that we compute how to do this from the point of contact, not from the air. In other words, from the moment when the hand actually touches the ball. We look where we want to go and we direct our touch on the ball accordingly. We don't compute the movement by trying to be in the air. We know there is time in the air as a product of the bounce, but that is very different. In other words, all the air time in the arm and in the ball is a result of the arm and ball actively making contact and going down. So the down movement is the engine for the whole process. This ties in with other areas covered in these presentations where the same principle applies, the martelet moments in the bow arm and the left hand reaching the point of sound. Everything we do in all activities functions from the point of contact or the point of verticality, and playing off the string is exactly the same. There's another important thing to notice in the ball bouncing analogy, that the fundamental organization of the arm doesn't change when we bounce the ball. Of course the arm has to move up and down, but the movement is still initiated by the forearm, with the finger, hand and forearm as a unit and the shoulder following. The basic alignment remains unchanged. If you try bouncing a ball from your wrist or from your shoulder, it doesn't work. So while the fulcrums in the fingers, wrist and elbow have to respond to the motion in the arm, they do not become the engine for the movement. The basic alignment of the finger, hand and forearm always remains unchanged, not unresponsive, but fundamentally unchanged. This is a central piece to understanding these strokes, because often the arm can be beautifully lined up in legato playing, but changes as soon as it gets into these off the string strokes. The most common changes come from trying to move the engine into the wrist, which usually results in the wrist lifting up, the fingers becoming floppy, or the arm lifting up in an attempt to create the lightness of the jump. So let's look at the basic alignment again and what we need to understand about the subtle adjustments that go on within the alignment when we start jumping. After all, we're aligned when we walk and we're aligned when we jump around with our legs, but there are some adjustments in that alignment that enable us to jump. So the purpose of basic alignment of the finger, hand and forearm is that it enables each part to do its share without going beyond what each part is capable of doing or beyond what it is designed to do. The fingers can only do their little share. The same is true of the wrist and the forearm, which does the bulk of the work. But the forearm alone can't hold the bow. The fingers are needed to do that, but can only do so easily with the help of the forearm. Where we get into trouble is when one part is doing the wrong amount of work and other parts start compensating. This fundamental principle is something for us to hold on to, particularly when we recognize that things are starting to feel wrong. When we think about jumping, we have to really understand resilience. As discussed in the presentation on tone production, we know that the bow arm uses walking hand and arm, and that there are two key elements to the principle of walking hand and arm. The first is that the finger, hand and forearm always travel together as a unit laterally or horizontally. And the second is that they always respond together in the vertical direction as a unit. This is just the same when you put your foot down. The fulcrums in the toes, ankles, knees, and hip have a response just like the fulcrums of the knuckles, wrist, elbow, and shoulder when the bow arm makes its vertical movement. We need to consider the vertical moment further. When we jump off a wall, the fulcrums of the hips, knees, ankles, and toes respond in a more profound way than when we just take a step. It is their resilience that enables them to give, but also to know when to stop, and then have the capacity to spring back up. If they're floppy, they can't spring back up, and if they're stuck down, they can't get back up either. It is their resilience that enables us to jump, and the same understanding of resilience that enables us to start to create these off-the-string strokes. Of course we need the up part of the jump, but it is the down that creates the up because there is resilience in the fulcrums, and they have the capacity to spring back. This enables the brain to remain in that down where it can compute the movement. We also need to remember that just as we found in the vibrato presentation, when a movement becomes smaller and smaller, the engine for the movement doesn't change. It may look different from outside, but the engine always remains in the same place. So while the bow stroke becomes smaller and smaller, the engine never moves out of the forearm to a different part of the arm. It always remains in the forearm. But of course, the smaller fulcrums are more visible when the movement becomes smaller. This is the same if I bounce an imaginary ball. Here's a large bounce, and here's a small bounce. So with the bow, the fingers and wrists become more visible in these tiny strokes, but they're not the engine. They cannot adopt that role without disrupting the mechanism. Let's go back to jumping for a moment. Imagine there are spots on the floor, and you're going to jump around the room from spot to spot. We could all do this successfully. What we would be doing is using our eyes to aim from one spot to the next. We do the same thing when we clap. Notice that when you clap, you don't go on a diversion in between the claps. You don't clap and then wander around. That seems funny to us because it makes such a nonsense of the movement. But that's often what happens when we try and play off the string. Of course, on a minuscule scale, but chaos ensues between the notes. So this brings us to an important principle. The end of one note has to send me directly over the start of the next, exactly where that next note needs to begin, without any extra preparatory movements. This means we have to learn to feel how the end of the little notes we are playing sends the bow to the start of the next note, and we have to know exactly where we want the next note to start. The first question is, how much vertical do we need? That depends on where you want to go and with what sound. When we think about jumping from spot to spot, we realize that we control how much vertical we're using depending on where we want to go. This is the same on the string. We also have to remember that we're working with the top or the surface of the string and not trying to sink below the surface in the same way that we engage with the surface of the floor rather than trying to sink below the floor. So we have to direct our thinking to the surface of the string. Of course, the string will go down as a result, but that is different from me trying to play below the surface on which I'm engaged. If you jump on a trampoline, while you see the bottom of it going down, the person jumping is engaged with the top of the trampoline. So up to this point, we know we will maintain the basic finger, hand, and forearm alignment to enable each part to do its share, and the engine will always be in the forearm. The movement will be controlled from the vertical moment, and there will be greater resilience in the fulcrums, enabling the arm to spring back. Each down or vertical moment will send us directly where the next one needs to start, with no additional movements polluting the continuity. So now we need a few more tools to make things work. We're dealing with tension and friction. If we try and jump on a very soft surface or a very hard surface, it affects our ability to jump. Likewise, if you vary the tension on a trampoline or just jump in different parts of it, you can feel those variations in tension and how they affect the jumping. We have ways to play around with that tension and friction on the instrument that are very important in the subtle ways we can make these strokes feel good and work well. The arm might be working with all the correct principles but still be having problems, and then it's usually a tension issue. We can vary the tension a number of ways. First, by how much hair we have on the string. If the surface area of hair to string is greater, then there will be more tension. So the flatter the hair, the greater the surface area, and therefore the greater the tension. Secondly, by how close or far away from the fingerboard we are. The string tension increases and decreases between the bridge and fingerboard, and we can play around a great deal with this aspect depending on how much we want the string to throw the bow back out. And thirdly, where we are on the stick itself. Every stick has its own characteristics, and we need to know where it functions best for certain strokes and dynamics. This is obviously affected by the previous two factors as well. And finally, the fourth one, which mostly comes in down bow and up bow staccatos, what angle the bow hair is meeting the strings. Adjusting this angle enables us to create considerable tension without the arm having to squeeze. So we have to keep all these in mind as we develop a feel for these subtle strokes and find exactly the right combination that makes the stroke feel good. The string itself plays a very important role. When you let your arm go up and down on your leg, just like this, the surface of your leg is not an inanimate surface. It is sending your arm back up. In other words, the bouncing works in both directions. The arm connects to the surface with enough verticality or down, and the surface helps throw the arm back up. If you try and do this without this element, you feel the arm and hand immediately tighten. So the string has tension in it, which enables it to send the bow back up. This springiness from the string itself becomes increasingly important in the faster strokes. We have a number of basic off-the-string strokes. There's staccato, spiccato, and the brush strokes. Let's start with the fundamental staccato. We need to be very clear that staccato is a spectrum of note lengths. That means anything that is not truly legato. We often think of staccato as short and abrupt, but it doesn't mean that at all. It covers the whole spectrum of just not legato. It's helpful to remember too that every short note, even the smallest, shortest notes, need tone. A straight staccato does have a speed limit on it, so if we need to go faster, then we're going to enter a spiccato stroke. So let's take a look at Brahms' scherzo, which has a clear staccato bow stroke. There's lots going on here. First, the bow has to start from the string. No one's ever won an Olympic high jump without starting from the ground first. So starting from the string is often misunderstood, and we get stuck without momentum because we're down and engaged so early that the down movement loses its propulsive quality. It would be the same if you wanted to jump with your legs. If you stay down, that first propulsive moment no longer functions. Often when this happens, we try and start from the air, but that can't work either because there's no propulsion from the air. So the bow arm needs to wait as close to the string as possible and then start from the first down on the string. We can only compute the movement from the string and the first down. The rhythmic expression is hugely important because it tells me how much sound I need to make on each note. Here it is slowly. I also need to be very clear that the third staccato note has to send me into the longer note value, or I won't be able to sustain the long note with any tone. I'll be landing on it as if it were another eighth note, which would sound like this. This is a very common error. We get the stroke going, but when we come to the end, instead of seeing that the last off the string stroke has to send the bow into a different note value, it sends the arm as if into another short note, and we have no tone on the long note. So here it is with me using the third note to send myself to the long note. We also need to think about the dynamics. These raise an interesting issue. We often try to use more bow to make more sound, but that's not really an option in off-the-string notes, as it changes the stroke completely. And if the tempo is fast, larger movements will be slower. If we go back to our original presentation on dynamics in tone production, we looked at how the arm can bounce on the leg, and we can create more or less very simply by releasing more or less energy or more or less let go in the arm. Sometimes I'll ask people to make a big red mark and then a small red mark on their leg. Everyone can do it easily using the principle of let go and adjusting how much they do. The more let go or release used, the more sound. It is not more weight or leaning into the leg, just more let go aimed at the surface of the leg. We can do the same with the off the string strokes. If we want more sound, I can release more and have more let go, and we'll get more tone. It may adjust the bow length a tiny amount, but that's different from trying to create the dynamic from the bow length. So in the Brahms, we need a fair amount of let go for the character. If I tried to make it with a longer bow, it would sound like this. And with let go. So in all these strokes, we need the principle of bow shaping as well, which was discussed in the presentation on tone production. The standard under-over shape is very common in these strokes, but the adjustments in the shaping to deal with the string crossings are very important, or we can find that the stroke has been going along fine and then is suddenly thrown off by a string crossing. In the opening of the Brahms, the bow arm is making the usual under, over, under on the first three notes. The long note gets another under shape. The shaping helps us accurately and efficiently go from the end of one note to the start of the next. Here it is in the Brahms. And again. Under, over, under. If we take the shaping out, it's very difficult to control and we lose momentum. And rather than feeling each note sending you to the next, it feels as though you have to move yourself from note to note. Here it is with no shaping. In the original discussion on bow shaping, it was clear how shaping not only affects the sound, but also the efficiency of the bow arm. This is true in these smaller strokes as well. The shaping organizes the sound and the movement. If we look at the second version of the same pattern on the B flat, we can see that the last staccato note includes a leap in both arms to get to the E string B flat. In the second version of this figure, we not only need to show the same three-note rhythmic figure, but the final staccato note has to include the leap to the E string for both the bow and the left hand. It doesn't mean that the final staccato note needs an accent, it just means it sends the bow and the left arm over to the E string. Both have to leap. We often try and do this one note too late, in other words, after the final staccato. If we're a note late in our thinking, we miss the sending note and we need an additional movement between the final short note and the long note, which makes it very uncomfortable to get there. When we realize that the final staccato note is the sending note and must send us to exactly where the high B flat needs to begin, we can get there easily. The bow shaping is crucial here also. It's just like the opening with the under, over, under, except when I get to that final note. The leap has to be an over shape. We looked at all the ways we can vary the tension. In this example, because it's relatively heavy, I'll need to find the combination of bow hair or bow surface area to string tension that works and feels good. If I have too much of either, the bow will start flying out of control. The excess tension throws it out of the string. Too much bow hair gives me this. And too much string tension gives me this. But the right combination will give me this. It's important to keep these variables in mind all the time, because you might have all the right elements working, but the stroke can be thrown off completely by these other variables. So let's play around with these tension variables and basic principles in some other examples which require a very different sound. If we look at Prokofiev's first violin sonata, the end of the slow movement has a decaying staccato rhythmic figure with a diminuendo. We need to control the rhythmic and dynamic changes within this. So here it is. In this case, the tone needs to have some edge to it. It isn't that fast, so I can create the edge by adding bow surface area and moving away from the fingerboard. The Brahms example started here, but the Prokofiev example is going to start here. where that extra tension can throw the bow back out in that edgy way. Here it is. I want a fair amount of sound too, so that there's room for the diminuendo. Here it's particularly important that the stroke's length doesn't change to do this, because I need to create the tone with the release or let go, or the sound will change. If I try and achieve the sound by lengthening the stroke, it will change the character. When the tension variables and principle of let go from the forearm are combined, it's possible to show the rhythmic changes and dynamic changes. These same principles enable us to create a heavy staccato. The scherzo of the same sonata requires a more aggressive staccato. This requires more verticality to throw the bow out of the string in this way. In other words, I have to go down more profoundly to go up more. There's clearly more air time, but I cannot achieve that by thinking from the air. I still have to create that from the down on the string. When we try from the air, the bow is immediately out of control and the arm is confused. You can take a passage like this and play around with the variables until you find the right combination. Let's try some different combinations. Here's more bow surface area. And less string tension. And then where it feels good. Let's take a look at the brushier off the string strokes. These have a softer sound. We clearly need more bow length to do this, but the longer stroke and gentler sound don't mean that the end of the stroke is vague or that the staccato rules don't apply. We're just in a different place within that staccato spectrum. Whenever we see dots on the page, we have to immediately think about how to interpret the dots and ask what their expressive purpose or role is. We have to be really careful that we don't go into the default short mode. So the end of one note still has to send the bow to exactly where the next note begins. Often the tone quality and lightness make us play these in a wishy-washy way, but the smallest, most delicate strokes and sound require the same accuracy, and all the same principles of being sent from note to note still apply. If we want less springiness, we need to adjust the tension variables also. So there'll be less bow hair, and I'll need to find the right string tension. The combinations of bow hair surface area to string tension are very subtle. It's not always the case that less bow hair means nearer the fingerboard or vice versa. Very often we need to reduce the bow hair but keep the springiness in the string. This is the case here. If there's less bow hair and not enough tension from the string, the stroke becomes wobbly. You can hear as I move it around how it changes. But when we feel the combination that works, the stroke is easy. It is a tiny, tiny change that has a huge effect. So here's a little Mozart example. Let's move to the spiccato strokes. When the bow touches the string, even in the tiniest way, the string goes down in a tiny amount. I'm going to play tiny over and under shapes, but they never actually leave the string. What sounds like it is off the string is actually the bow leaving the most concentrated point of sound at the high or low point of the shape. This makes it sound off because there's a natural decay in the sound due to the shaping, but I feel and am really on the string. Here it is again. It's important to let the bow arm be thrown out of the string. Remember, it's always a two-way relationship. The string has tension in it that will throw the bow back. So all we really have to do is to engage with it in a way that allows it to throw us to the next note. We can do this by visualizing the string being active into the bow hair rather than the reverse. In the presentation on tone production, we also looked at using the in and out motion, which takes us nearer to or further from the fingerboard to create color and nuance. We can use it in these tiny strokes to great effect as it helps us create the rhythmic structure of the passage and show the contour of the line. If I take one note and show the spiccato in a 4/4 meter, and then a 3/4 meter, and then a 2/4 meter, you can hear the change in the contour to reflect the change in meter. So here's 4/4. Here's 3/4. Here's 2/4. So I'm using the in and out to create that rhythm. Let's look at a straightforward example from Chardesh. This just needs to have the basic under and over shapes plus a little bit of in and out to keep the meter organized. Here it is slowly. And a little faster. In the Zigeunerweise, we can play around with adjusting the stroke from smoother to shorter. Let's try that. I know what the basic principles are and what the variables are, so I can diagnose anything that feels wrong or seems to be responding in a way that I don't want. Every bow and violin will be slightly different, so it will take feeling out where the stroke works best. A common problem with these types of passages is we try and play the whole passage on the first note, which produces a lurch into the passage rather like standing at the top of the stairs and hurling oneself down instead of putting one foot down on the first step. That would sound like this. It sends the bow into chaos rather than just starting. So the first note is just that. It just needs exactly what is necessary for that first note. Let's take a different example, the opening of the Mendelssohn Scherzo, and see how all the things we've looked at can interact in this passage. The first thing is to put in the bow shaping, as we have to cross strings which can immediately throw the bow off. The bow shaping is exactly the same in bars 1 and 2 and 3 and 4. If I'm going to start the passage up bow, then I'll start with an undershape. The 16ths will go under, over, under, over. The 8th notes will go under, over, over. And this undershape included a change of plane to get me to the A string, and then another overshape here to get me back to the E string, undershape, under, over, undershape, change of plane, over, over, under. When we add the in and out motions, we can gain even better control of the stroke. I'm going to play towards the fingerboard on the 2nd and 3rd eighth notes of each measure, which helps smooth out the bow further and create the feel of the 3/8 meter. So I'll do it slowly. A little faster. So altogether, these enable the bow to feel stable on the string and the lightness of the stroke to come out. There are many other examples to look at, but the few here illustrate the basic off-the-string toolbox needed to address these types of stroke.